The last thing I want to talk today about is the physiology of stress and provide some basis for that. And again, we're going to be building on this throughout the course, and so some of the terms here and some of the processes and biochemicals are things that are going to come up again later. And again, this is a shorter lecture today because you also watched the video, so that also counts as part of lecture. So just briefly, before I gave a definition of stress that included the physiological but also the psychological and emotional, but when we're talking just within the physiology of stress, often the definition that's given is that stress is anything that throws your body out of allostatic balance. And I'm going to spend a lot more time in the future slides here, just coming up, going into what allostatic load is and what allostatic balance is. But just for now, just keep this definition in mind, that stress is anything that throws your body out of this balance. And your stress response, the physiology of your stress response, is your body's attempt to restore allostasis, or to restore that balance. And so this can occur, importantly, in the presence of an actual threat, right? If a lion's really chasing you, you might have a stress response, but it could also happen in anticipation of a threat. So if you're anticipating something bad happening, like an upcoming test, that could be something that could lead to a stress response. And it can also happen in reaction to an imagined threat. Often we have one of the recurring dreams is that you've forgotten you're in a class and you've missed a test. I still have this dream all the time that I've forgotten that I'm enrolled in a class and suddenly I've failed it. And so this can lead to a very real stress response, even though nothing is actually occurring. And so again, it can happen in response to a real, anticipated, or imagined threat. And the goal of this physiological stress response is to mobilize energy from our storage sites in our body so that we can use that to cope with whatever this threat is. And as we'll see, many of the threats we need to cope with now don't really require this type of physiological activation, and so this is where long-term negative effects from stress can occur. And also it's important to inhibit further storage of energy, because there's no point wasting time doing that. For example, again, if you're being chased by a lion, you don't need to store energy for later, because it might not matter. There might not be a later. And so your body puts all of those long-term repair and energy storage processes on hold and tries to mobilize as much energy quickly, again, in order for you to deal with that threat. And so I said I'd explain more about allostasis and allostatic load. So these are so allostasis is the term for your body's maintenance of an appropriate level of activation under changing circumstances. And that's a lot of words to say that this is really about your body wants to have the correct level of activation for what you're engaged in. And this is similar to the idea of homeostasis that you've learned about, and I'll compare them directly in a moment. But allostasis is a bit different. And so it's about maintaining a specific baseline level of calmness, like homeostasis might be. Allostasis recognizes that there's different levels that might be adaptive or ideal for different situations that you might be in, right? The ideal state might be very different when you're taking a test than when you're trying to fall asleep, right? You don't want to be totally relaxed and calm when you're doing something that you want to be really cognitively engaged and energized for. So allostasis recognizes that there's not just one optimal state, that the optimal state is going to depend on the situation that you're in. And allostasis is also really about coordinating system-wide changes in the body, and that includes changes in behavior. And so we might want to raise our heart rate, but in order to do that, we're also going to need to breathe faster, and other things are going to happen in our body as well. And so these are really system-wide changes. It's not just that one thing occurs to bring us back to balance. We really need to mobilize multiple systems in our body that are interconnected to respond to the threat. And again, because stress can occur in anticipation and in reaction to it, allostasis or changes to it can occur in anticipation of a stressor occurring that would change this set point, right? So you are expecting that this bad thing is going to happen, and even though it hasn't happened yet, your body's preparing itself to be perturbed in some way, to be threatened, and so it starts to mobilize those responses even though nothing's happened yet. So again, to compare to homeostasis, something you probably learned about in biology, maybe in high school, right? So homeostasis was the idea we had previously about that the body, that when we were stressed, we would be pushed away from our baseline rest, our our homeostasis, this optimal level, and this would be related to an optimal level of heart rate, an optimal level of blood pressure, but there would be one level for each physiological function, right? Your resting heart rate and your resting blood pressure. But again, allostasis recognizes that there's not going to be just one blood pressure you should get back to or one heart rate you should get back to, that the ideal or optimal heart rate is going to depend on the situation you're in. You want a much lower heart rate when you're trying to fall asleep than when you're trying to run away from a lion or when you're trying to engage in a cognitive task. And homeostasis also held with it the idea that our physiological levels are adjusted by these local regulatory mechanisms, meaning that if our heart rate goes up too high, to bring it back down, this one system will come online to bring that back. And again, allostasis recognizes that all these systems are really interconnected, and so it's not just about if our heart rate goes up, we bring that back down by activating a nerve that lowers our heart rate, but that's also going to influence our breath rate, our cortisol levels, and all kinds of other systems in the body. So again, these are very similar ideas, but there are these slight important differences between the two. And Robert Sapolsky, in the readings that you did for this week, also talks a lot about this. And again, this is also going to be a topic that comes up later in the course as well. So allostatic load is a specific term that's used to refer to the wear and tear that occurs to the body when a person is constantly trying to get back to allostasis, right? If we're having many perturbations to our physiological levels, we're facing many different stressors, then that's going to, over time, lead to wear and tear on the body. And because every time we're activated and our body tries to bring itself back to rest or tries to mobilize its resources to cope with a threat, that takes energy and that takes a toll on the body. And so in any given moment, that's not a big deal, any given particular stressor, but if we're doing this over and over and over again over time, that can take a toll on the body, and this leads to wear and tear. And so allostatic load is a specific way that we assess stress by looking at the toll that it takes on the body. And so allostatic load is a summary indicator that's used in research where they look at the functioning of your heart and your lungs and how much plaque is in your arteries, and look at a whole bunch of different physiological indicators and take a summary of all of those, or an average, to look at the overall impact of stress on your body. And so this is a common measure that we'll see in the literature. So it's interesting because allostatic load is both like a measure of stress, right? We use this to index the stress that people have been exposed to, but it's also an outcome of the stress, right? It's what's happened to the body as a result of repeated stressors in the body's attempts to maintain allostasis. Okay, so now that we've introduced those terms, I want to talk some more about the actual physiology and what's happening with the stress response. But before I do that, I want to situate where we are in the body and within the nervous system, right? And so if we think about the overall structure of the human nervous system, it's hierarchically organized, right? So we have our central nervous system that's made up of our brain and spinal cord, and those are super important, obviously, right? We know this. This is what controls so much of our behavior. And then we also have our peripheral nervous system, and this includes the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And so the somatic nervous system is also often referred to as the voluntary nervous system. This is the part of our nervous system that controls our voluntary movements, right? So if we want to move our arm or our leg, this is the part of the peripheral nervous system that is controlling that. But then we also have our autonomic nervous system, sometimes called our involuntary nervous system. And this is where we're going to be focused today. This is really critical in responding to stressors. Right? So this is something that we don't have direct control over, although we'll complicate that a little bit in our coping lecture on how we can use some meditation practices to shift our physiology. But for the most part, we cannot really intervene in these processes. This stress reactions occur without conscious awareness and control. So this is the involuntary nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system is made up of two different parts. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And so the sympathetic nervous system, again, if you learned about this in bio or a previous course, this is often called is what controls fight or flight, right? This is the part this is the wing of our autonomic nervous system that activates energy, mobilizes the body for response to potential threats, and so this is associated with increasing heart rate, breathing faster, more sweating, and it decreases gastrointestinal activity. Right, you stop trying to digest and store food because, again, there may not be a need to. If you don't successfully cope with this stressor, you won't need that energy later. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, and so this is sometimes called the rest and digest wing of the autonomic nervous system. And this is what assists in recovery following arousal. It promotes relaxation, and so it decreases our heart rate and our breathing rate, and decreases sweating and increases gastrointestinal activity, among other things. And so we are usually taught that these are two, totally separate systems, and you're either activating your parasympathetic nervous system, when you're going to sleep or you're relaxing, and your sympathetic nervous system when you're being chased by that lion or engaging in some type of other active, stressful situation. But really, it's not quite that simple. It's not that it's one or the other. Both are active at the same time in alternating fashion, and that'll be important again in our next lecture on coping when we talk about the impact of breathing on the heart and heart rate. We're going to see that these things are not totally separate, that they do work in opposition to one another, but it's not over long periods of time like that. Both can be active breath by breath. Okay, so our autonomic nervous system again has two pieces to it, right? We have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic one activating us and the parasympathetic calming us. And this potentially intimidating looking figure is really just to show you all the different parts of the body that these systems connect to, right? We said that these are integrated systems, and so the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system both connect to your eyes, to your lungs, to your heart, to parts of your stomach and gastrointestinal system, liver, to our adrenal glands, and even our sex organs. And the ones we're really going to be focused on here are the heart and our adrenal glands. And again, the heart will come up again in our next lecture on coping, but our adrenal glands, as these are the center of secreting some of our main stress hormones, as we'll see.